Alright, so today we're going to be talking about something that doesn't get brought up enough. Future Gohan versus Android Saga Vegeta. And yeah, before anyone jumps to conclusions, we're going to scale both of them properly. So no headcanon nonsense. No what if he trained more hypotheticals just based on what we know and what the series shows us. Future Gohan is often downplayed because he doesn't have any on-screen feats that go crazy, but people forget that this is a dude who was fighting killer androids alone for years, lost an arm and still kept going. He's essentially the last real fighter in his timeline. No backup, no sensu beans, no hyperbolic time chamber. He was surviving in constant war conditions, which forces growth in a way characters in the main timeline have never had to deal with. Now, Vegeta during the Android Saga is a completely different story. This is a version of Vegeta who broke his limits out of pure rage and Saiyan pride. He hit Super Saiyan and immediately body bags Android 19 like it's nothing. His confidence is through the roof for a reason. He's got the power to back it up. The real question here is, can the future timeline's experienced and battle-tested grit overcome the raw power and ruthless drive of Vegeta in his prime? We're going to look at their scaling, feats, and statements because one of these guys walk out of the fight on top, and it might not be who you think. One of the first things that needs to be addressed when comparing future Gohan and Android Saga Vegeta is how drastically the outcome of this matchup can vary depending on whether you're looking at the anime or the manga. So let's begin by focusing on the anime, then tackle the manga afterwards. A major point of interest comes from a statement Trunks makes during the Android Saga, where he notes that the androids in the present timeline seem to be much stronger than the ones in the future. He says this shortly after being overwhelmed by androids 17 and 18. At first glance, this sounds like a straightforward comparison, but when you break it down, the statement doesn't fully hold up under scrutiny. For starters, the android's energy cannot be sensed through traditional key detection methods. So when Trunks says this, both when reflecting on the androids from his future and during his encounter with the ones in the present, he isn't exactly basing the statement on any measurable power level. He's instead making a judgment based on the experience of the battle. Since he now knows how strong he and Vegeta are and remembers how he fought back then, he assumes the present androids must be stronger because the fight felt more intense. Trunks even adds that at the very least he was able to hold his own against the future androids. But this again doesn't align with what we actually see. In the history of Trunks Special, Trunks is constantly outmatched and overpowered. In their final confrontation, Trunks is running for his life inside a destroyed building while the androids are practically treating the encounter like a game, mocking him and toying with him at any turn. Later, when Trunks returns to the future and defeats them, the androids are surprised that he's even still alive after their last encounter. Android 17 even comments on how much he's improved when he sees Trunks blocking Android 18's attacks, which were enough to anger her, something that he hadn't done in their previous battles. This clearly implies that Trunks had never come close to matching them before. If anything, he barely survived. So Trunks never saw the full extent of the android's power during this time, making his comparison between the timelines kind of flawed. At best, the only thing he could say really is that the present-day androids showed more of their strength than the future counterparts did during their earlier fights. This isn't the only time Trunks makes a questionable call, however. During 18's battle with Vegeta, Trunks is impressed by Vegeta's strength, mainly because he's surprised to see someone seemingly holding their own against an android. But even this impression is misleading. Moments later, Piccolo points out that Vegeta's stamina is gradually depleting, while Android 18 having infinite energy isn't getting tired at all. This often leads people to wrongly assume the two were on equal footing, with stamina being the only factor separating them, but that's simply not accurate. It isn't until Piccolo merges with Kami and faces off against Cell that Android 16 makes a noteworthy comment, stating that someone had finally emerged with enough power to rival the androids. This clearly places Kami-fused Piccolo as the benchmark, so unless you think Super Saiyan Vegeta was stronger than or equal to a fused Piccolo, which even Vegeta himself admits isn't the case, then Vegeta was never close to matching Android 18. And all of this points to one conclusion. Trunks, while experienced, doesn't have the most reliable track record when it comes to assessing power levels. His belief that the present androids are significantly stronger than the future ones is based more on perception and incomplete information than an actual measurement difference. So the statement, while interesting, doesn't carry as much weight as it might seem at first glance. Now, with all that said, it's worth pointing out that Android 18 herself does acknowledge Vegeta's strength to some extent. During their fight, she mentioned that she didn't expect to be pushed this far by a man. However, she quickly follows that up by saying that if this is all he has, then he's not much of a threat, and proceeds to break his arm and completely incapacitate him. Even so, Vegeta's strength during this point in the story shouldn't be underestimated. Piccolo notes that following the 3 years of training leading up to the arrival of the androids, Vegeta had managed to surpass Goku. Considering Piccolo had spent those 3 years alongside Goku, his assessment holds some weight. This is further supported by Goku himself, who comments that if Vegeta can't handle the android, then he probably won't be able to either. At the very least, this suggests a level of relativity between the two. In fact, nearly everyone is surprised by how much stronger Vegeta has become, far beyond what was expected of him. Now, switching the focus to future Gohan, things become a bit more nuanced. A quote that often comes up in discussions is when Gohan explains why he wears his gi resembling Goku's. He says that he designed it in that way because he hoped to one day be as strong as Goku was, but admits that he hasn't been successful in that regard. This indicates that at the time of making this statement, future Gohan didn't believe he had reached the level Goku had attained before dying from the heart virus. However, it's important to note that Gohan does continue to go stronger after Goku's death. In fact, he clearly improves over time, especially after losing his arm in his final confrontation with the androids. Despite being outnumbered, Gohan puts up a significantly better fight than he did in previous encounters and is shown winning a beam struggle between the two. So while he may have felt inferior to Goku at the time of that comment, it's entirely plausible that later on he closed the gap, or even surpassed him before dying. Another key detail is that Gohan wasn't necessarily referring to Yardrat Goku as many fans assume. Goku spent 3 years training in preparation for the android, so it's only natural that he grew stronger in that time. Even in future Trunks' timeline where Goku wasn't aware of the android threat, he likely continued to train, as simply that's part of his nature. Saiyans constantly push their limits through battle, and Goku is no exception. So while Gohan's statement implies he was weaker than Goku at one point, it doesn't mean that remained true indefinitely. As time passed and Gohan continued to battle, especially under extreme conditions, it's likely he experienced significant growth, his own evolution, even in the harsh future timeline, which shouldn't be overlooked. Now, when comparing future Gohan and Android Saga Vegeta, one of the most reliable ways to gauge their relative strength is by analyzing how they performed against the androids, who act as a power benchmark between them. In Vegeta's case, although Android 17 does compliment his performance as being impressive, it's made clear that Vegeta still falls short of being able to defeat either 18 or 17 on his own. Meanwhile, future Gohan is shown in both his major confrontations with the androids to be significantly more capable. Even with just one arm in his final battle, he manages to overwhelm them individually and only falls after being ambushed by both siblings working together in perfect coordination. This paints a very clear picture. Gohan holds a considerable advantage in terms of power and effectiveness. Not only did the androids feel the need to jump him in both encounters, but he also is able to draw blood from both of them at multiple occasions. The only real argument that could shift the outcome in Vegeta's favor comes from Trunks' statement about the androids in the future being weaker than their counterparts in the present timeline. If you take that claim at face value, then Vegeta's struggle against the androids in the main timeline might be more excusable, and a stronger case could be made for him winning, since Gohan would be doing better against weaker androids. But if you disregard that statement, especially considering Trunks had no real way to gauge their power accurately, it becomes difficult to argue against Gohan. Vegeta's individual dominance against the androids compared to Gohan's need to be tag team suggests Gohan would win quite convincingly. But depending on how you interpret Trunks' statement, or if you give it validity, Vegeta may have the edge here. Now, in the manga, the matchup plays out very differently, depending on how you interpret certain elements. While many of the same statements are consistent with the anime, there's a few key differences. For one, Gohan's remark about not being as strong as Goku is placed just before his final encounter with the androids. An encounter that doesn't reflect too well on him. In fact, Android 17 is able to kill Gohan on his own without assistance from 18, and even comments that during their previous encounter, he was only using half of his strength. This heavily downplays Gohan's performance in the manga and suggests that he's much weaker here compared to his anime counterpart. Additionally, the manga doesn't show Trunks fighting the androids. Without that scene, it becomes much more plausible that Trunks might have had a closer encounter with them, leading more credibility to his statement that the androids of the future were weaker than those in the main timeline. This could potentially shift the scales in Vegeta's favor. It's reasonable to assume that in the manga timeline, Vegeta was at least approaching Goku's level before the heart virus took effect, mainly due to his competitive nature and desire to become a Super Saiyan. While he might not have grown as much as he did in the main timeline, it's hard to imagine him slacking off entirely in his pursuit of power. However, there's another wrinkle to consider. In the Dragon Ball Super manga, there's a brief panel showing the Z Fighters battling the androids in the future timeline, and notably, Vegeta is not shown using Super Saiyan. If you interpret this as canonical to the original Dragon Ball Z timeline, it adds a major blow to Vegeta's case. A non-Super Saiyan Vegeta, regardless of his efforts, likely wouldn't be able to defeat future Gohan. Of course, that all depends on whether you view that Super manga chapter as connected to the original timeline. If it is, then Gohan decisively wins. If not, then you believe Vegeta had access to Super Saiyan in the manga continuity and the edge might lean towards him. They do look pretty beat up in that manga chapter, so it's very possible that Vegeta wasn't Super Saiyan, but due to fighting fatigue, it wore off. All things considered, future Gohan seems to have a stronger case for victory in the anime version of the events, and in the manga, the outcome is far more dependent on your interpretation of the source material, making it a situation where the winner flips entirely based on what continuity and details you choose to accept. Ultimately, it becomes a fight that's not even close, just in very different directions depending on the version you're analyzing.